covered. So for those of you who were not part of the Builders Panel discussion at the City Commission meeting on January 26th, I'll just give a tiny bit of a review. Essentially, we were joined by 4 folks who are developers and builders of affordable homes. You see 3 of them here on your screen today. And they did a work session essentially with our City Commission on January 26th. Unfortunately, we had a WebEx meltdown, pretty colossal, and we just had to, the meeting was adjourned. There was no way that we could continue. So thank you for joining us again today. Our panelists are Tracy Menuet of HRDC. Hey, Tracy. Jeff Anderson and Steve Demick. Jeff Anderson is with Good Neighbor Partnership and Steve Demick with GMD Development. And Greg Stratton was also with us, and he's with Kilday Stratton. He's a builder here in town of affordable homes and market rate homes. So what I thought we could do is just sort of let each of the 3 of you talk for a couple of minutes about your role, your organization, just in case there's somebody online today that wasn't part of that original discussion. And then we can kind of get going with questions and answers, unless the 3 of you have made a game plan ahead of time that I don't know about. Otherwise, we'll just launch in. All right. Well, again, I'm Tanya Andreasen. I'm the Community Housing Program Manager here at the City of Bozeman. I'll toss it over to Danny Hess. She's doing our tech, but she's also our Neighborhoods Program Coordinator here for the city. And she'll give us a couple of instructions about Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Tanya. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just some tips here for us as we enter into our discussion. Like Tanya mentioned, we'll be doing some Q&A at the end, and we encourage you to use the question and answer box. And so the way that you can do so is to move your cursor over to the lower right side of your screen, and then you'll see a participant panel there with a little icon that looks like a person with 3 lines next to it, and then a chat bubble. And so if you open that participant panel, you'll see there that one of the options, one of the tabs there is Q&A. So if you click that tab, you'll have the option to type in a question there, and that'll just line out the questions for us in order that they come in. And so at the end of the session, we'll be able to go through those in the order that we get them. The other option that you have is to use the chat box to send messages to other attendees or to the host. You are free to do so. We just encourage you to enter in your questions for after the discussion into that Q&A tab. So that's all I have. Oh, I guess the other thing I'll mention is that we are recording this session, and we'll be sharing a video of the recording on the community housing webpage so that folks can access this and share it around with others who might not have been able to join today. All right, we'll get started.
All right, Jeff, do you want to, well, his camera's off for a second here. Steve, would you like to get started and kind of introduce yourself and your organization, your role?
Oh, it looks like you're on mute, Steve. Or if you're having audio troubles, you can click the little caret next to that mute button at the bottom of your screen and change audio settings. Sometimes if you have like a Zoom window open, that usurps the WebEx audio, so you can click around there.
Steve, while you're fiddling with that, maybe we'll toss it to Jeff and let you get started, Jeff.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So Jeff Anderson, I'm a principal at Good Housing Partnership here, located in Bozeman. Affordable housing developer. We typically partner with whether it's nonprofits, housing authorities, different municipalities, or private partners to develop affordable housing throughout the country. We're used to the various tax credit programs on the LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit side. There's also, some nuance in new market tax credits and just other avenues to bring online additional affordable housing. So that's me. And we're currently actually working with HRDC here in Bozeman, of course, and in Livingston, and then also another public housing authority in Montana, renovating all of the public units there as well.
Tracy, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. I'm Tracy Menuet with HRDC. I'm one of our associate directors and our community development director. HRDC has been building and preserving housing across the spectrum since about the mid-1990s. We developed Montana's first community land trust homes, which is our West Babcock Community Housing Trust off of 24th and Babcock. Since that time, have worked very actively in building, developing new homes, both rental and ownership, homes for ownership. But we've also worked very actively with partners like Jeff on preserving those homes that are already in our community, whether it's on the rental side through preservation of HUD and rural development subsidies, or on the ownership side through the implementation of community land trusts. And then, of course, working with private partners like GMD to bring more affordable rental units to our community. And I guess I should add, we are covering the lowest end of the housing continuum by providing emergency shelter to our friends and neighbors experiencing homelessness.
How's it going, Steve?
Can you hear
I
me?
can hear you.
Yay. Sorry about that. Steve Demick, GMD Development. Thanks for having me again. Just quickly, GMD is, we're based in Seattle. We're a small private firm, there's 8 people. It's about a 10-year-old firm, although most of us, its principals have been doing this for many decades, affordable housing, that is. GMD has been active in the Northwest, Alaska, Montana, Idaho, and Washington is our primary markets. We have done a lot of preservation work with Section 8 and RD, and then also probably more recently we're focused on new construction using tax-exempt bonds. And we've completed one project in Bozeman, that's Larkspur Commons, and are under construction now on Arrowleaf and Perennial with HRDC as our partner, which we're very excited about, and also partnering with community health partners in Family Promise to be in the same campus. So very excited about that.
All right. Well, we're starting to get questions in the chat box, and I have some questions here that have been submitted ahead of time. So if it's okay with everybody, I think we'll just kind of try to pick up where we left off that evening. It might feel a little bit weird at first, but just try to flesh out your answers and maybe repeat yourself a little bit from that disastrous evening. So Danny, is there a question from Commissioner Magic? Is that the first one there? It says, before the January 26th meltdown, or perhaps during the meltdown, I asked about how city planning processes might be improved to help affordability, from Commissioner Magic. Do you want me to sort of toss it to a person, or do you want to step up and let me know who wants to try to take a stab at it?
Well, I'm imagining Greg might have written a small response to that. And I don't know how we best incorporate Greg's responses, because I know he has a lot to offer in this area as well. Mm-hmm.
I'll try to speak up for Greg whenever I can. Yeah. Why don't you get us started, Tracy?
Okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, and I referenced this in the meeting that we had previously. I think that when you look at, you know, the best practices that they recommend for communities, Bozeman has either implemented or is in the process of implementing nearly all of them. You know, there are only so many levers at our disposal. And, you know, I'm trying to refresh rapidly in my head, you know, we are undergoing a UDC review, right? To see like, what are the pieces that might impact housing affordability and processes. I know that we continually get told, you know, speed, right? If everything goes faster, everything gets better. And that's not always true. You know, I think that we have to just kind of essentially acknowledge that lots of planning and zoning policies are in place to protect the people who already live in a community and to fulfill their expectations of that. And so how we can blend growth and providing more housing affordability with those expectations, I think is a pretty important function of the planning office. So I would say the other thing that the planning office has just implemented is the development review coordinators. You know, that's a best practice that's been recommended by a lot of places, and I think that's going to have some great results for us. But, you know, ultimately, I think that what I kind of see from the planning, you know, there are certainly regulatory things that we can do to improve the process, and I think we're doing it. But the last meeting, I compared it to rowing into a waterfall. And, you know, it doesn't matter how much everyone's rowing in sync and doing all of the things together. We have a really big challenge that we're trying, you know, this is a hard thing to do. So I think that in a lot of ways, we are doing a lot of things right. And there are certainly some small things that can be improved, but there's a lot of things happening right now that are not within the control of the planning department.
I think what I heard Greg say that evening was that time is money, essentially. And I won't try to quote him directly, but he did talk about, you know, how much it was costing per day when there was a delay in a review. And so I think that was kind of a summary of Greg's point that evening. Jeff or Steve, you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think time, to Greg's point earlier, time is definitely important. And I think even, and Steve mentioned it too, you know, if you acquire land and the process takes a very long time to close on a tax credit financing, that money outstanding definitely hits the total project feasibility. I think it's interesting on Greg's perspective versus ours, and just the speed of projects going through the planning phase. I think Steve and I will probably focus in on more 100% affordable, or the majority of that, while Greg is more focused on a market rate with, you know, some affordable homes. So I think, you know, making that process more efficient is important. And then from a supply side, obviously, you know, the supply and demand, if there's more supply out there, I think that'll help bridge that gap in the literal bridge in the community development plan. I think the real difficulty is the 80% or the non-quote-unquote affordable, the missing middle projects are difficult to think through in this conversation, because there's no truly targeted financing for those, as like there are to low-income housing tax credit projects that can now skew up to 80% AMI. So I think that's part of it, supply.
Yeah, I can just jump into the, you know, time is money on every development, you know, particularly if we need to quickly buy some land, you know, if entitlements and permitting takes a year, I mean, that's, you know, we're paying interest for a year, and that adds to our development costs. And actually doesn't generate tax credits either, so it's sunk money. So, you know, again, speed is really important. I just want to note the other speed thing is beyond building permits. Once we get under construction, it's if we have delays in inspections and things like that. So kind of the interest clock continues past just start of construction. So, the more you can help us, once our contractor gets to a certain point, if there's inspectors available, and I think that's seems like it's been an issue of just, capacity of getting folks out there to sign off. That does have an impact too. It's kind of a lot of factors all add up to, cost to the project.
Okay. I have a question here from Deputy Mayor Cunningham for Steve. May as well stay unmuted, Steve, for a second here. He asked, you mentioned that some municipalities are pushing for HUD to let local communities draw their own maps to indicate where housing assistance is most needed, as opposed to accepting the qualifying census tract map. What would be the process for getting this done? Does it require both federal and state action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think just big picture, I mean, what's keeping more affordable housing from happening is one is land, the other is financial feasibility. And financial feasibility is, I mean, it's like razor thin. We need every advantage lined up. And one of the big advantages we have is if we're in a qualified census tract, you get a 30% boost to tax credits. And, as we talked about last time, the problem in Bozeman is it's such a limited area. And there is talk about, there's always talk about improving the low-income housing tax credit program, how it can, deliver more units, more housing, and kind of expanding that QCT area is one of them. It absolutely would be a federal action required because it's a federal tax, code question. You might be aware that the 9% tax credits that are, allocated by the state agency has the authority and the discretion to give a 30% boost if you're not in a QCT. So what we're talking about, or what I was talking about, is having that same discretion for 4% bond finance projects, and that would be really helpful. And I would encourage us, that kind of our main, or one of our main advocacy groups is called the Tax Credit Coalition, and their website is taxcreditcoalition.org if you want to look it up. And they always list their priorities of what they're advocating for. This QCT has kind of been on their list. I was just looking this morning. It looks like it's not on the top of their list, but I think this could be a great tool and would give you more control. So I think it's it's talking to your senators, your state senators, or U.S. senators to make that part of kind of the next round of kind of program adjustments. And there's kind of, seems like every few years there's some adjustments and to benefit. So that'd be my suggestion. Lobby those folks, and then it would be the state agencies that would have that discretion that you could discuss with them and hopefully help direct it to where you want it to be.
On a more local side, I think I'm not as familiar with the 4%, the matching 4% that's going through the state right now, or getting worked on by the state. So I think that would be something more local on the state side of things for more equity. It might not be the QCT or DDA fix, but there is a proposal for a matching 4%, which, without getting too much into the low-income housing tax credit world, just gives more equity to a project. Obviously, therefore, feasibility is more attainable. So I think the Montana State 4% matching credit would be something people could absolutely get involved in.
Okay, I have 9 questions from Commissioner Cunningham. So let me read the chat box here, and I have to admit it's really hard for me to read the screen. I have almost 50-year-old eyes. Are there areas where you feel the city is involved where you don't think they need to be or shouldn't be? Oh, that's from Kevin Thane. Tracy, do you want to jump in on that?
So the question is where they're involved, where they shouldn't be? Is that the question?
Yeah, he says, are there areas where you feel the city is involved where you don't think they need to be or shouldn't be? Perhaps about our policies, operations, programming having to do with housing?
I mean, I would, I mean, you and I have talked about this enough that you know that I would like the city to be more involved in many aspects of housing affordability and not less. I think that there are lots of opportunities for the city to be, and I think that as the city hits entitlement status, you know, the city's role in housing is going to change drastically once you hit that HUD entitlement status. So I would probably advocate for more involvement. I think that there are certainly these questions of things like design guidelines, and I think that's probably what people get to when they talk about that, right? Like how much, you know, to what extent our design guidelines sort of read as like community covenants, and how much of that is necessary or unnecessary. And I do think that there's some good conversation to be had around that. I am not a code nerd by any stretch, but I do know that there have certainly been times where we've had discussions about, you know, design standards that, you know, we look at some of our, you know, most prized real estate and commercial developments and we say, wow, that wouldn't have actually met the new guidelines. So I do think that there's some space in that part of the discussion, but if anything, I would love to see the city be more involved in housing affordability, not less.
Got it. I'm going to ask a question of Jeff. You indicated that the city should zero in on and prioritize the specific type of housing that they believe is most needed in the community and gear our efforts to incentivizing the production of that type of housing. Based on your assessment of the Bozeman market, what housing type do you believe the city should be incentivizing?
That's a tough one. I think I'm more looking at it from a, you know, the different AMI standpoint there, median income standpoint, and just what tools developers have and what tools the city has to make those viable opportunities. You know, obviously from a low-income housing tax credit rental side of things, you know, the 60% skewing up to 80, and you average out to 60% AMI. So that's kind of the sub 80% AMI for rentals is a viable, there's viable opportunity to make projects work using 4% tax credits and bonds. I think the, you know, per your housing needs assessment, the missing middle is the classic, you know, there's no rental programs to make those pencil. Granted, you know, from a rental side of things, the residents could pay higher. So is there a rental subsidy from the city? On the for sale side of things, I think it, you know, TIF districts obviously would help those out by way of, you know, they're generating taxes on the condos themselves or the homes themselves. So I think it's partly kind of looking at each of these groups and, you know, rental versus home ownership opportunities and prioritizing, or at least seeing what tools are in your club set. I mean, the TIF districts would be great for the for sale side of things, for, you know, qualified census tracts on those sides. For the rentals, I think part of the difficulty with the rentals is that nonprofits are brought in much of the time for tax exemption, so you can, you know, get a little bit higher debt and make these projects feasible. So, you know, in a TIF district, that's difficult there. So maybe workarounds there, but you know, I think there's a need across the spectrum in the bridge, and it's really seeing what is most attainable kind of in the immediate future, and then longer term plans, bond measures, whatever it may be, to infuse more capital into projects, and having that certainty of capital stacks and, you know, one element there. That didn't really answer the question, but I think it led to more questions.
Yeah, and
It's
Greg
tough.
actually
There's
has,
no silver bullet.
no, go ahead.
No, there's no silver bullet. So it's kind of, you know, you have to look at each of these in a different light. You know, the very, very low income, sub 30%, you know, that takes a subsidy of some sort, a rental subsidy, to make those projects from a new construction standpoint feasible. Obviously, we can't lose housing stock on the tax credit side or subsidy side, because that's very hard to come back. So it's really seeing, you know, the immediate stuff and the more attainable ones in the immediate future, and then game plan for those longer term goals of bringing on 30% AMI subsidized rentals in the future when the city has a larger pot of money perhaps to subsidize projects.
Yeah, and Greg kind of made a point as well about targeting certain AMI ranges, and he says, I believe the Bozeman Community Housing Action Plan bridge is already outdated. The bridge called for inclusionary zoning to apply at price points between 100 and 120% of the AMI. I wouldn't be surprised if the missing middle has not migrated as high as 150% of AMI. And so he suggests, should we reevaluate the price range for inclusionary zoning and how that is applied? If we adjust the cash in lieu values to encourage that direction, we can use cash to assist projects at the lower AMI ranges. So that's just a little piece of input about missing middle and project funding. If indeed what you're saying, Jeff, is that there's less federal or public dollars available for missing middle housing, maybe the city's focusing its effort at that missing middle is what you're saying, and then offset, and then using those public dollars to offset projects at the lower AMI ranges. Is that what I hear you saying? Yeah.
I mean, I think the roadmap to getting a 60% AMI project built is a little more. There's a little more certainty there than kind of using all the different approaches to getting the missing middle. But I think, you know, I think that the need is throughout the spectrum. So it really is where one starts and kind of where is the city's dollar go furthest. And I think, you know, in that light, it might be the low-income housing tax credit projects, whereby there are these other federal tax credit programs and state, if you can get 9% tax credits, or not state, but it is, and make those work. So I think I'm all for, you know, obviously incentivizing all of the, you know, from the lowest to through the missing middle. But I think there's just the missing middle, there's less, as you said, less federal kind of guidance or help. So that would be an interesting one to think through.
A question from Deputy Mayor Cunningham to Tracy. Can you elaborate on partnership and employer-based programming ideas that you referenced? What organizations do you believe would be right for such a partnership?
Okay, sorry about that. Something is frozen on my screen right now, but I think I was able to override it. So yeah, I think that employer-based housing, you know, even in the city's affordable housing needs assessment, we found it is something that many employers are already doing on a less kind of scaled version. I think we see a lot of it already on kind of the lower end of the housing continuum in kind of that workforce dorm style housing. And then on the highest end of the continuum, we often see it as kind of an executive search type of perk. So how you can kind of scale it to more folks within the middle of the housing continuum, I think makes a lot of sense. You know, examples nationally, obviously, large community employers that own land are sort of the low-hanging fruit, right? So hospital systems, school districts, and other large employers. That tends to be kind of the easiest piece to implement, but I think that there are a lot of opportunities, even for small employers who maybe don't have a large piece of property that they can develop and utilize for their employees. There are some great examples nationally of how an employer, a small employer may buy into, say, a community housing trust, and they essentially would cover the subsidized difference, and then that becomes a home that they get to utilize for their workforce. So that's an example of how that can be done. There are certainly all sorts of, there's a lot of work around that to be done, because it's sort of like tying your health care or your health insurance to your employment, right? If your housing is tied to your employment, that does create some different questions. What if you're not working there anymore? But there are some really good examples of ways that we can work with, particularly our school and our hospital systems, to start creating more housing for their workforce, which does create more housing opportunity across their entire community.
Steve, you identified a long-term land lease as a possible tool for affordable housing development. Does that model work for LIHTC projects? What other types of projects would that work for?
Yeah, I mean, it can work for a tax credit. There's a lot of projects that have been done with long-term land leases. In the tax credit world, the land is a big cost that doesn't generate any tax credits. So to the degree that we can get land either donated or leased, that helps financial feasibility in a lot of cases. I think my suggestion before was if the city was able to, identify land where they want affordable housing and purchase it and offer it to developers to do, as a long-term lease. It'd have to be, like a 99-year lease, but, it'd be a way for the city to control that virtually in perpetuity to keep it as affordable housing. So it would definitely be a strategy to use.
Jeff, Tracy, or Steve, has anything come to mind that you'd like to just kind of bring up right now? Should I keep asking questions, or are there a couple of points that have come to mind that you'd like to raise? Keep going. Okay. Just checking. Okay. Follow-up question from Kevin. Given that you indicated that you would like to see the city more involved, Tracy, see the city more involved in affordable housing, what suggestions do you have for greater city involvement?
Yeah, I think that, obviously one area that has always been really difficult for all of us, as far as a community response is, at the lowest end of the housing continuum, and that is, our community response to homelessness. I think the city has done a good job in the last year of stepping up and providing some assistance, with how we can provide emergency shelter. But, when we talk about housing affordability across the community, I always remind people that, the Government Accounting Office found that a $100 increase in median rents corresponds to a 9% increase in community homelessness. And that's a national statistic, but I think that we know what's happening in our community with median rents and with home prices for sale. And there are certainly some knockoff effects further down the continuum. So I think that, in every community that I've worked, it's really easy to talk about home ownership because everybody loves home ownership. And so we get a lot of times very wrapped around putting all of our resources in maybe missing middle housing or in those higher income levels. And sometimes at the expense of the lower end of the housing continuum, where the actual costs of providing services may be much higher. So we know that, if somebody is housed, they actually are going to, the community incurs fewer costs as far as healthcare and social services. And So I think that we can sometimes lose focus in those areas where community investment might have the most meaningful impact. And I think that's where I hope that when we talk about, so the city's involvement, I think that, you know, they've been very involved in our Fuse efforts because they understand that. But I think that when we have community discussions around housing affordability, I want to continue seeing them across that continuum.
Jeff or Steve, you have anything else that you'd like to contribute on that one? Anything that you'd like to see the city take on?
I'll jump in. So I think one of the earlier questions was a revolving loan fund. You know, as cities, and we're finding this in Washington too, as housing heats up. I mean, the few sites that are available, I mean, it gets very competitive. The price of land gets bid up, and you know, for us as affordable housing developer, you know, it could a year to get entitlements and get ready to close, but we often just have to grab the land and close in maybe 90 days. So, you know, and most lenders will, I don't know, they'll go 50, maybe 60% loan to value if, you know, and so that still leaves a good chunk of cash that we need to tie up for quite a long period of time. So, you know, if the city were to have a revolving loan fund and we could pay this back once we closed on our construction loan, that'd be helpful. It would, you know, just because of the large amount of, you know, cash up front it takes for the land and then to get all the pre-development work done, that would be an important tool. And that is being done, like in Washington. There's a you know, land acquisition funds that get paid back by the developers.
Jeff, this is your chance to add to my scope of work. No.
You're muted, I think, Jeff.
You're muted.
There we go. And I don't know, you know, specifically within the city, I think there's interesting in thinking through, you know, TIF versus non-TIF. Is there a payment in lieu of taxes, a pilot program that could be put in place? And I'm not, you know, typically we're, you know, looking at tax-exempt properties or fully taxable, but, you know, going down that route, there are comparables in other states and other cities, of course, where there might not be a full tax exemption, but you can get a payment in lieu of taxes, which might help feasibility work out while still benefiting the city on the tax generation.
Danny, are there other questions in the chat? Okay, I have some more from my list here. This one is about PUDs. Tracy, you mentioned in January PUD by right, entitlements and reworking the PUD points system. Do you believe that increasing the point value of affordable housing or energy smart housing and decreasing the point value of open space would result in more affordable or sustainable housing?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, that was a couple of things. One is just that, you know, many of the things that we have to ask for in a PUD are things that, you know, in many communities would just be rights of development, and you wouldn't necessarily need a PUD to ask for them. So I think it is kind of a two-part, right? There are certain things that I think we should just allow through our standard entitlement process and not make people go through a PUD, because PUDs do add time and expense to process. So I think that's part one. I think part two is in those instances when we have to go through a PUD, how do our points, you know, how do we gain points? And I think my thought is, I do think the affordable housing portion of the PUD is not written in a way that it is utilized very often. I think that it could be rewritten to be more attractive. So I think that is one piece of it. I think the second piece of it is simply maybe as part of that PUD requiring at least some level of diversity of points, right? Because I think that if I'm a private market developer, most of my incentive does feel very much around like adding open space, adding those things that would create more value within my project. And so I think really kind of requiring some level of diversity in the PUD points. But I would recommend a rewrite of the affordable housing section, period, and just letting more things happen without a PUD.
Thank you. Either of the others have an opinion on that question? I have just a note here from Greg. See, I had my eyes on it a second ago. Let's see. So this is about funding. And Deputy Mayor Cunningham asks, how important is a sustainable funding source, such as a possible community housing mill levy or bond, to the projects your organization typically works on? And I'll let Greg respond first through me, and then you all can answer. He says, very important. In order for the affordable housing program to work, we need a continuous source of cash. Cash allows us to respond to opportunities as they are presented to us. As we discussed in the meeting, the most productive projects to date have been affordable housing projects in which the Community Affordable Housing Fund has provided direct cash assistance. Currently, our cash balance in the Affordable Housing Fund is low to the point that if an opportunity was presented to us, we would not be able to provide the level of assistance we have in the past if we could provide any assistance at all. So that's Greg's input on that question. Any of the three of you like to take that one on? Funding.
Well, I'll speak up. I know we've used the funding on our last two projects, and even though you'd say if you look at the whole total cost, it's maybe a small percentage. It's really an important percentage. Many of these tax credit projects, I mean, they're feasible just by a very, very thin margin, and that's on both of our projects, both Larkspur and Early Criminal. I mean, that's literally meant the difference between getting us across the finish line and not. So it is a really important piece. Plus, I would say just to, our investors or lenders, it shows local support. It kind of speaks volumes as well.
Yeah, I'll reiterate. I mean, I agree with everything Steve said, and then, it does create a level of predictability to some respect in the project, and obviously it is whether it's done in initial phases or later on. Obviously, earlier on, it would create a critical aspect in the capital stack. So I think to those points, it's very important to have a stable funding source, which, obviously, growing that source for more projects and a deeper dive into the subsidies or the, lower income folks, that's the way to do it, is through that funding source.
Yeah, I would agree. Consistency is a priority, I think. As noted, we've had a lot of projects come through just and I think a lot of times, and I think Jeff and Steve would agree, we don't necessarily have a lot of control over our timelines, particularly for things like preservation. When an owner calls and says they're selling, we have to respond, and we don't have a lot of time. So, knowing that there's a consistent funding source, I think is very helpful. I know that on the projects that we've done, that local funding source leverages a lot of other investment, both in state and local, funding, but also in private investment. Arrowleaf and Perennial are going to carry a lot of private debt. And so there's a lot of investment leveraged by what do feel like relatively smaller amounts. But knowing that there is some consistency there, I think is critical.
So again, here's a question that Greg responded to. So I'll ask the question and respond on Greg's behalf, and then you all can take it, about infrastructure and paying for infrastructure costs. There were suggestions that there should or could be some financial assistance for offsite improvements. Any idea how that might specifically work? And Greg's response says, he kind of refers back to the funding source. If an offsite improvement is triggered by one of our projects and there was a reliable source of cash available, we could request assistance through KHAB and the Community Housing Fund process to help with the improvement. The agreement for this assistance, which could be in the form of a grant or low interest loan, could be tied to some level of affordable housing within the project. We could use this as a tool to reduce the upfront direct cost of the project. Repayment could be as a release at the sale of each lot or as a fee when the building permit is pulled, whichever comes first. That's Greg's idea. You guys want to talk about infrastructure?
There's a question in the chat box there too.
Okay.
I can just read it.
Okay, no takers
I
on
can
that one.
definitely say,
Oh.
yeah, infrastructure is, I think like it used to be land. Land used to be the thing that it felt like was my primary barrier. As the better to develop land is all kind of utilized, now it's infrastructure. And of course, it's the cost of materials has gone through the roof. It's also that. So there's, really, I don't even get to pick two things that go well anymore. All three of them are really a challenge. But yeah, I think, that just goes to the, creating a consistent funding source that can be tapped into for a variety of things, whether it be low interest land acquisition fund or, offsite infrastructure, or whatever it can be to help us respond rapidly, carry some slightly lower costs while we wrap things up and then move to the next stage. I think that it goes back to that consistent funding source that can be utilized perhaps on kind of an RLF type of basis.
I'm trying to remember the terms, but there's a city improvement fund that I think, there was some offsite work. It was sort of identified with Arrowleaf Perennial, and we did get some relief. Was it CIP? I'm blanking out. So I'm wondering if you can't earmark part of those funds for projects that are affordable that are required to do some off-site work. Might be a tool. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think like the CIP, what that does, Steve, is that if it's on the CIP, it allows a percentage of that is associated with kind of new growth to be covered from impact fees as well as the new development application. So it's kind of so yeah, it's really helpful to get projects with affordability on the CIP, and yeah, perhaps like some level of priority would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to read another question in the chat. A little bit lower. There we go.
While you're pulling it, another thing I would add is just kind of flexibility for the timing. And I think that Greg sort of alluded to that, but flexibility for timing of your offsite improvement.
Mhm. Given that most market developers opt for cash in lieu to cover affordable housing requirements, would it be worth moving away from inclusionary zoning / the affordable housing ordinance and enacting a more broad funding source like mill levies?
Well, we might not have a choice on that one, right? Like, that choice may be made for us, but I think that it's always a bad idea to forego, I mean, resolving affordability issues requires a lot of tools in the box. And to kind of stick all of your eggs in one basket and say like, oh, well, we won't do this because we're going to do this instead, it kind of requires a push across all of the spectrum. And so I think that, if we're able to keep our inclusionary zoning ordinance, yeah, maybe there are tweaks that need to be made to it, but I wouldn't say get rid of the ordinance and just do this. Because it's not just funding, it's not just units, right? It's all of those things. But I don't know, Steve or Jeff, do you have anything to add on that one?
Said it better than I could.
Yeah, we don't get involved much in inclusionary zoning. It's, we're more in the 50-60% AMI. I mean, I guess in general, I feel like, particularly with the affordable, I mean, it's a real program heavy, in some ways it almost doesn't seem fair to push that on market rate developers. I mean, kind of let them do what they're good at and let us do what we're good at. It's kind of my thinking, but I think it has worked okay. And, if that can do the fee in lieu and generate funds, I think that's a good thing.
So if not inclusionary zoning, how do we incentivize the development of kind of the housing types like townhomes, cottage homes, and other missing middle housing in Bozeman? That's a question, sort of truncated question from Deputy Mayor Cunningham, but if not inclusionary zoning, if we're not mandating it, how else do you think that we might incentivize it or bring it forward?
Well, I'll jump in. And to me, I think it's all about density, having more land zoned for attached housing. I mean, I think that's what's affordable. And you've seen a lot of cities around the country, even outlaw single family zoning, that's pretty extreme. But the key is just to have more density, more attached housing, because I think that's when you get more of the middle income, type of housing product.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I think that, the difficulty there is, right, there's nothing prohibiting our market from doing that right now, right? Like, there's absolutely nothing prohibiting people from building townhomes and condominiums. They just don't make as much money doing it. And I think that's the challenge, right? Like the incentive, for a market developer is, it is a financial incentive. And if it's not there, they are going to build the product where the margin is higher. And, I mean, I don't see Bozeman doing anything to prohibit the types of development that they want. The lack of incentive is, from my perspective, it's a market issue. It is not a City of Bozeman's doing something to stop it from happening. And I don't know, I mean, I think that Bozeman's done a lot of things over the past to try to incentivize diversity of development. And without kind of putting in some type of capture of that value, you know, so things like restricted size lots, restricted size units, you know, they said, oh, we'll allow you to build smaller homes on smaller lots. And people said, that's amazing, but there was no cap on transfer price. So any of that community value that was created around smaller homes, smaller units and density just sort of disappeared into the ether. And I think it did drive density, right? It did help drive some of those things, but it didn't bring prices down. And I think that's the disconnect that, you know, had we fixed it 10 years ago, we wouldn't be on the phone today. So.
Yep. Looks like Hannah Van Wetter has a question. The city of Missoula just made headlines by approving the sale of city-owned property for mixed-use development, including permanently affordable housing in a community land trust. Is the city of Bozeman able to consider doing anything similar to this? You guys want to answer that question for me? That might be directed at me.
I was going to say that's not for me. Yes, they can. They must. No.
Yeah, I read that headline too in that article, and I've been following a little bit. You know, I guess I'm one single person and I'm one city staffer, but I guess my answer is I hope so. There's a lot of bridges to cross and decisions to make, and if that's how the city, the community, and our community as a whole decides to prioritize our efforts, it seems like that it's certainly worth investigating. That's a hard question to answer. It's pretty complicated. And certainly there'd need to be a funding source like they have in Missoula. Are there any more questions in the chat? Sorry, it's hard to see because I don't know, you can't probably even see my fingers, but we've got about, you know, a teeny tiny little square where we can see the chat below all this other stuff on WebEx, so I apologize.
Yeah.
Oh, here's one. What about, from Deputy Mayor Cunningham, what about lowering the cash in lieu amounts, but broadening it to include condos? So that's a question about our inclusionary zoning policy. We have set cash in lieu rates that are developed each annually and published annually. And I think the deputy mayor is asking about, you know, what if those were lower? And with the idea of potentially more developers would choose to pay cash in lieu into our community housing fund, which would make that fund revenue higher, so we could contribute more to these other projects, community projects. I'm extrapolating Deputy Mayor Cunningham, so I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but I think that's the meaning. Yep. So broadening the IZ to include condos and lowering the cash in lieu amount. Do you think that could bring more affordable homes online?
I mean, I think from a funding source standpoint, as we've said, it kind of everything comes back to that stable funding source, whether it's targeting a deeper affordability or, you know, just bringing, you know, additional middle, you know, the missing middle online. So I mean, obviously from the exact amounts, we'd have to look at that, but you could lower it for condos, I guess, and keep it the same on non-condos. I don't see why you just lower it across the board. If people are still paying it in on the single family homes. Mm-hmm. But yeah, obviously more funding into any sort of funding source would certainly bring additional units online.
Yeah, I would just kind of add it to the list of like potential, you know, tweaks to explore with the inclusionary zoning ordinance. You know, we know that it's not quite hitting the targets that we hope, and So, how maybe to bring in more broad-based funding, increase units, I think those are all things that should be on the table for review.
I'm going to break again and ask the three of you if you have anything anything that's come to mind. We've got, looks like 10 or 14 minutes left. Anything that you want to bring up?
Hmm.
It's okay if you don't. I'm just checking in with you. Okay.
The one thing we haven't talked about, and we maybe touched on it briefly in January, but I think that, something that's, we talk so much about new development and, new construction and new. And I do think that how we can, some of the things that I think about, obviously we do preservation of subsidized units, right? But we have this whole realm of, and I get made fun of every time I use the term, but this is the term, is the naturally occurring affordable housing. These are the units within your community that, whether it's age, condition, whatever it might be, do not command the same premium as other homes within the community, and how we can, make sure that those homes are safe but are still available to folks with lower incomes, I think is important. And it's not something that we talk about a lot. But when I think of like mobile home park conversions, and we just have seen several of those in the last 2 years, but that is something that, how our community addresses, seeing maybe an older apartment complex, be replaced with newer luxury condominiums, right? Like that is a housing affordability issue within our community.
I think there's and Tracy, I just want to say, when I rode my bike all over this town in the 80s, I certainly rode my bike right outside City Hall here to the North Side neighborhood. And there were little teeny tiny homes where 3 kids shared a bedroom, and the yard was tiny and the house was old and the Formica was peeling, and a lot of us lived and still live that way. And there is sort of maybe cultural acceptability or there needs to be a conversation maybe about housing and what we accept socially, I guess, sort of a philosophical conversation. One of the questions in the chat box says, it's from Emily Talego, has a progressive local income tax ever been considered to provide funding to housing projects? In any of the other communities that you work in, Jeff or Steve, have you guys do you have experienced the progressive local income tax?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Tanya, I was going to say, there are some communities that have like excise tax, like recording. So you pay just a small sliver when you sell a property. I don't know if that even be legal in Montana, but
it's against the Montana Constitution, unfortunately.
Okay.
Real estate transfer taxes are disallowed.
Okay.
Which is unfortunate because, when we're asked to talk about, comparative communities and, we talk about here's how other communities fund these things. And then we have to immediately drive through the list and be like, here are the things they use to fund them. And here are the things that we don't have available to us, right? So like whether it's a sales tax or a local option tax or whatever it might be, we end up having to cut a few things off pretty quickly.
That's too bad. Yeah, I mean, the excise tax, even just like 0.1% or, it's kind of a lot of nickels that add up. But, all right.
anybody have any questions they want to enter in the chat before we sign off? I'm going to run my eyes down my 2 pieces of paper here and make sure I have it all covered. I think, you know, Greg, I'll just read a couple of points that Greg makes here at the end of his note. He just says that, and it's kind of reiterating some of the points that have already been made today, just that building costs are increasing at a rate that makes building at the lower price points almost impossible without some significant form of assistance. Just really feeling that pinch. And then he says, in the end, much of the problem comes down to supply and demand. At this time, there's very little opportunity to provide affordable housing. We need to get projects moving to increase inventory and the opportunities to provide more affordable housing. And kind of his last 2 points are the need for, they're a little bit disjointed, but the need for offsite improvements should be closely evaluated for each project. The need for and timing of these improvements are vital to the cost of and success of a project. And Tracy, I heard you say that earlier. It's not only paying for those offsite improvements, infrastructure, but also the timing of requiring them to be developed. I think that's it from my list here. Let's see, one more question from Emily Talego. How do we get the state legislature to allow more tools? Emily, is that with regards to sort of tax tools, taxation, or I think that might be a follow-up to her question just a second ago.
I mean, there are certainly some ways. So we, of course, participate, as you know, Steve had mentioned, Low Income Housing Coalition, Tax Coalition. We participate in the Montana Housing Coalition, and they do a great job of letting us know what are some of the policies that we should keep an eye on and be advocating for. As Jeff mentioned, the state housing tax credit is a big one. Funding of the state housing trust fund. You know, there are, I know there's a local option tax that is, I don't know where it is yet. It is maybe, if it's not dead, it probably will be quite soon. But in this session, I think we might want to be grateful for what we're able to hold on to. But I do think that the Housing Coalition does a great job. So I would recommend following them. And they do a great job of keeping track of opportunities to let your legislative body know how you feel about housing and its importance in your community.
Any last words, Jeff or Steve? Tracy? Okay. So I just want to thank everybody for coming online today, coming online January 26th for our panel. We, of course, are all experiencing all kinds of hassles and disruptions and stressors regarding COVID and the pandemic, and this slightly awkward WebEx format for hosting this kind of conversation is tough, but I think it's worth it. So thank you very much to our panelists and to everybody online today for bearing with us. I think these discussions are really good to have now and over time, and I appreciate you being here. All right, 12:55. Everybody have a really good long weekend. I think we're going to sign off.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.